I thank the honourable member for Cowan. The immediate question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. When the Coalition came to office in 2013, the bequest from Labor was $274 billion of gross debt, on a trajectory to $667 billion by 2030, after Labor had inherited themselves a $20 billion surplus and another $45 billion in the bank. Labor's bitter bequest to every man, woman and child in the country, after 6 years of waste and mismanagement, also included $240 billion in consecutive big budget deficits. First $27 billion, followed by $54 billion, followed by $47 billion, then $43 billion, then $18 billion, finishing with yet another $48 billion. When you add it up, that's about $240 billion in deficits. And that was the dismal case, Mr Deputy Speaker, even though, according to the member for Lilly, at some stage of the projection process, every Labor budget was miraculously going to be in surplus. But when you are letting spending grow at an average of 4.5% a year, with revenues nowhere near that, Labor's claims to be perennially on the verge of surplus was always deliberate, Mediscare scale and style nonsense. Mr Speaker, this was the worst inheritance for any incoming Australian government in our history, even by the famously weak economic standards of the Labor Party, which sadly Australians are now very used to. Labor always spends us into trouble, and the Coalition always comes in and has to sort out the mess. That's been the pattern practically since Federation, and that's what this bill, the National Disability Insurance Scheme Savings Fund Special Account Bill, is all about. Labor announced the NDIS in the same way it announced the also hugely expensive Gonski Education Plan, with absolutely no idea about where the money was going to come from, which was the height of irresponsibility, and so typically the way of Labor governments, especially from 2007 right through to 2013, across all policy areas. Now, both ideas, Gonski and the NDIS, especially the NDIS, I have to say, were morally sound. The case for a greater level of care for almost 1 in 5 Australians with a disability and their carers is indisputable, just as was the conclusion that, as a country, we desperately need to do something about the tragic decline in the quality of education, especially for children. To Labor, as always, the solution was just more dollars. But they didn't have the dollars, and they had no real prospect of getting the dollars. They uttered vague rhetorical ideas about where the dollars might come from, and when they did try to give some undertakings, they were vague and ultimately, I believe, misleading. Monies they implied were tied to the NDIS weren't. Billions in alleged NDIS funding was double-counted, a standard Labor trick. Labor was effectively just like one of Charles Dickens' fictional characters, Micawber, who always assumed that something would just turn up to solve a problem in due course and in fullness of time, maybe on a time horizon so far into the future that it's just not really worth worrying about today. Well, sadly, Mr Deputy Speaker, that's the attitude Labor has taken on funding for the NDIS. But of course, as we all know, nothing just turns up. To fund such a program like the NDIS, it requires a lot of hard work and a lot of decisions, of the sort put forward in this very bill. The Speaker who just spoke before me, Mr Deputy Speaker, the member for Longman, I have no doubt that she's right in claiming that every stakeholder she speaks to wills the NDIS to succeed. They want it to succeed. I believe that's right. I think she's probably right. However, wishing for something is not the same as planning for something. Wishing for something is no substitute for planning for it. And this is where Labor always goes so fundamentally wrong. Once again, therefore, it's left to the coalition to do the heavy lifting, to do the hard work, to clean up the mess and to plan ahead. Labor's funding gap for the NDIS in 2019-20, when it becomes fully operational as a program, is $4.1 billion, growing to $6 billion a year soon after. It was and it is a ridiculous, totally irresponsible black hole. The staggering $32 billion that the scheme is expected to cost within a decade of becoming fully operational was never on the Labor radar. But it is on our radar. And that's what the establishment of the National Disability Insurance Scheme Savings Fund Special Account is indeed all about. This is the fund that will become the Fort Knox for the NDIS. It will start with a contribution of $2.1 billion from reforms of the disability support pension and other changes in the welfare system that aim to make it fairer, more finely targeted and, more importantly, accountable to the taxpayer. It will be augmented over the years by a new spending regime and savings from across government, including $3 billion via measures being put forward to this parliament in associated bills. That's money that will both take care of the short-term funding shortfall and set in train a process for guaranteeing funding into the future when the scheme will be exponentially more expensive. Again, the former Speaker, the member for Longman, talked about the importance of certainty. And it doesn't matter if you are running a commercial, profitable business or a not-for-profit or a charity. Certainty is key. And there is no greater certainty that you can provide a player in any sector that is reliant on government funding than the certainty of funding. But the black hole created by Labor is the very thing that undermines confidence. And we cannot have this sector continuing to lack confidence because of a funding black hole. And so here we are yet again in this 45th Parliament, Mr Deputy Speaker, with all eyes on Labor and their allies, the Greens, and the crossbenchers in the Senate. All eyes are on them yet again to see if maybe, just maybe this time, they will do the right thing and work with us to protect the NDIS by supporting this bill and other associated measures, I should say. I commend the bill to the House.
The immediate question is that the amendment be agreed to.